Welcome back. So in this video, let's discuss more of this diagram that we see here. So first of all, I want to talk about the CDN at a later point. It's not really important right now because we need to understand more of what's happening with these other pieces before we can understand what a CDN actually does. So let's remove that from the picture. Next, what we need to discuss is, well, we've already talked about the DNS, so I'm also going to remove that. So what we're left with is the browser client, the load balancer, and the web servers. But in order to understand what a load balancer does, we need to better understand the client communication with the web server. So we're going to focus specifically on this communication here. In order to understand this, we need to think back to our original example that we learned in an earlier lesson when we were trying to access the Facebook server in order to access facebook.com. So when we made this request, remember that here what you're communicating to is something that before I called a Facebook server, but really you can pretty much think of it as a web server or as an application server. It's interchangeable roughly. Essentially all it is that it is just some server somewhere that takes some request about a web application, and then it sends back the appropriate files to the client that it then uses to either build the whole website or maybe build out a portion of the website. Now, why do I say out a portion? Well, let's take the example of facebook.com again. When we have learned about accessing the Facebook website the first time, we typed in facebook.com and we got back the entire website, meaning we got back all of the files required for us to load the initial page. Now, if you've built any kind of web application before, you're very familiar with what's happening here. If we narrow down instead of not the whole application, but a specific feature on facebook.com, specifically the newsfeed, what's happening here in the newsfeed? Well, the newsfeed has a bunch of posts on it. These posts, as you know, with Facebook newsfeed, is updates from friends. Maybe they're different articles from these different newspapers or magazines that you're subscribed to. Maybe they're updates from different groups that you're signed up to. The main idea here is that these posts are most likely chronologically ordered based on when these different posts themselves were created. So as you navigate through this newsfeed, you should see different posts, most likely in chronological order from the newest to the oldest. Now, let's block out everything else and let's just hyper-focus on this newsfeed because here we're going to understand more about what a web server is doing. When you think about the actual newsfeed itself, what's happening is that when you first land on the website, let's say for simplicity's sake, we have two different posts. These are the latest posts that are relevant to us, our specific user, so your specific profile. Here, what you do is you see the two, and you're like, okay, maybe I've read them, maybe I don't care about them. As you scroll down, what happens is Facebook will then load you two more posts. Again, you might look at them, you might be interested, you might not be. You scroll again, and Facebook will once again load you two more posts. And this goes on and on and on until you have no more posts left, which, let's be frank, never happens. What's happening behind the scenes here is that your specific user, let's say I'm user 1, I am requesting posts to a web server because the web server has to give me the data for these posts. Again, on my browser or my client, I don't have all of this data. I don't know. My phone or my computer or my browser has no idea what it needs in order to figure out what the latest posts are. A web server is figuring that stuff out. My client is the one that's sending the request for more post data to the web server. And then this web server is sending that post data back. Most likely, this data is in the format of JSON. So this web server sends it back as a response, and then my client will use that JSON to build in the new posts that I want to see. So if I keep scrolling, as we saw in our previous example, chances are what's happening is I'm actually sending another request to the web server, and then the web server is sending me the appropriate posts JSON. So this is a cycle that keeps going whenever I need new posts. Now, in order for us to understand more about what a web server specifically is, we need to understand this in the context of being able to deliver some specific functionality or purpose, such as the appropriate posts for the appropriate user. The core things that make a web server work is pretty much something that allows a web server to run application logic and a database. Now, what is application logic? Application logic is pretty much the low-level code that you write on the day-to-day as a developer. Maybe this is the JavaScript code you write, the Ruby code you write, the Java code you write, maybe the Carbon code you write. All of that code that you are writing as a developer serves some kind of application logical purpose. You're trying to derive some kind of outcome, maybe a combination of multiple outcomes, but there are a sequence of steps that a computer can understand. And the computer in this case is the web server. This application logic is trying to apply some type of transformation steps on some specific data. In our particular case with the posts, it's all of the post data. Now, all this post data has to live somewhere. It most likely lives inside of a database. The database is solely meant to hold data in specific categories. In our particular case, all of the post data probably lives in a post-related database. The application logic will then sift through all of that data to find the appropriate posts to send back for a specific user. There may be billions of post data, maybe trillions of post data, and the application logic has to figure out within those billions to find the two that user wants to see right now. So that is the two combination of things that drives a web server. Now, when you think about the web server, we're talking about right now just one user client trying to ask the web server for posts related to user one. But you can imagine with an application like Facebook that there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands, even millions of users all trying to access that web server to get the relevant post for them. So this is something that is constantly happening, which is putting our system under an enormous amount of traffic and an enormous amount of strain. Now, in order for the web server to function and run that application logic, it needs to actually consume resources. To do that, it's not free. Now, if you've ever built a computer before or worked with a computer before, you know what these resources are. It's pretty much some kind of storage, some type of memory, some type of processing power, and then some kind of network. Now, storage in this particular case, you can think about as like your hard drive on a computer. On the laptop or the PC that you're running right now, you have a hard drive. On this hard drive is some memory that it can use to store long-term memory. RAM here, when we talk about memory, is pretty much short-term memory. And this is what your computer needs in order to actually store some temporary but quickly accessible data that allows the applications to run smoothly. Processing power is the actual CPU unit inside of your computer that allows you to run logical programs. So application logic runs on a CPU. And then network speed, well, network speed is pretty much just the access to the actual internet and how fast that access is. So these four things comprise of the main resources inside of a web server that are being used in order to perform that specific logic that we're doing. So in our particular case, we're serving up posts. These are the four different resources that are used for the web server to do this efficiently for the millions of users. Now, with a web server, when you think about it, the more traffic there is, the more these resources are being consumed in order to do so. So how do you actually increase the capacity for your web server to do this? Well, this is where we talk about different types of scaling, and there's two main types. There's vertical and there's horizontal. So let's first talk about vertical scaling. Vertical scaling is where you have your web server and you're saying, hey, I need more resources in order to serve more users and more requests. How do I do that? I'm just going to vertically scale, meaning I'm going to increase these different resources on this one server. If I need more storage, I'm going to add more hard disks. I'm going to increase the amount of storage space I have. If I need more memory, then I'm going to add more RAM chips. If I need more processing power, I'm going to increase the power of my CPU. If I need more network speed, I'm going to increase the network speed on this specific server. The key idea here is that you are just increasing the resources available on this one specific server. This is actually different from horizontal scaling. Horizontal scaling means that what you're going to do is you are going to duplicate or clone the actual web server. So here, each server has maybe the exact same amount of storage, memory, processing power, and network speed. But what you're doing is you are cloning this server multiple times. And you can be cloning these virtually. And that is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what this kind of virtual cloning actually represents, because right now it's probably a little confusing. Vertical scaling is really obvious. With your computer, if you've ever built a desktop before, if you want more memory, you can just add more RAM chips. We've done that kind of upgrade before. With web servers, it's not necessarily the same. You can actually horizontally scale through cloning, which you can't do with your physical computer the way that you probably have before, unless you've specifically done this exact action. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. We're going to discuss horizontal scaling.